السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن سيدنا مولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله. In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful, all praise is due to Allah, the Lord of the universe, the master of the day of judgment. I bear witness and testimony to the oneness of Allah, to His magnificence, His omnipotence, His might, His glory, to His being the creator and sustainer of all things, the giver of life, the guider of hearts, the master of the day of judgment. And I bear witness to the fact that Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is His servant and final messenger. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him and upon all those who choose to tread in his path until the last day. It is said that on one occasion the Prophet ﷺ was standing with his companions during the days of Hajj. And as they were standing, the Prophet ﷺ started to pose different questions to his companions. And to all of them, out of deference, they just stayed silent. He stood in the place of Arafah and pointed in the direction of Makkatul Mukarramah. And he says to his companions, Ayu baladan hadha, that what city is this? And the companions, they know that this is the city of Mecca. They know their home, they know of its sanctity. But because they respect the Prophet of God, they don't say anything. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, is this not the city of Mecca? What our teachers tell us is that they respected him so much that if at that point he had said it was now called something else, they would have just taken it because of their love for him. And after he asks this question, he then poses another question, Ayu shahrin hadha, that what month is this? And they know that it's the month of Dhul Hijjah. They know that it is a month that is arguably so sanctified, so sacred, that within it you have the performance of the Hajj, within it you have the day of Eid, within it you have the day of Arafah. But still they're silent. And the Prophet says, is this not the month of Dhul Hijjah? And then he poses the final question to them and he says, Ayu yawmin hadha, that what day is this? And they know that it is the 9th of Dhul Hijjah. They know it is the day of Arafah, arguably the most auspicious day on the Islamic calendar. The day that is equated to the Hajj itself, where the Prophet ﷺ says in the hadith, Al-Hajju Arafah, that Hajj is Arafah. A day that if you have ever been blessed to go for the Hajj, and may Allah make us from amongst those who are blessed to visit His house, that you know it's a day that you will carry with you forever. A day unlike any other. And still they're silent. And the Prophet says, is this not the day of Arafah? And now after the Prophet has established that they are in a sacred city, in a sacred month, and in a sacred day, that the sanctity is so high, it is so prevalent, that the metaphysical blessing that is there is something that no one can have any doubt in. The Prophet says this to his companions, that know this. The rights that you have over one another, the bonds that exist between you as brothers and sisters, the relationships that you have amongst each other, these are more sacred than this day and this month and this place. A lot of the times it's difficult for us to be able to be with others in the true sense of what this deen calls for. We get stuck in a place where we see ritual as an ends rather than a means to an ends. Our assessment of our relationship with God is not necessarily based off of our own spiritual journey, but we seek to measure who we are in terms of our proximity to Allah by seeing where others don't have any closeness through our own perspective. We elevate ourselves by denigrating others. We look to see where it is that they are lacking and how it is they don't fit into our standard of what it means to be, quote unquote, an actual good person. And in doing so, the individual that gets hurt the most is not the person who is recipient of our ill words and our ill intentions or our glances that look down upon them, but is our hearts that are going to be hurt the most. Jazakallah khair. Where you get to a place where the notion has to be understood that people are people. And this deen is not a deen that is tied to just putting people into boxes and assessing their goodness based off of a measure that has nothing to really do with them, but has everything to just do with us making ourselves feel better by making somebody else feel worse. And the coming of Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam was not meant to fuel this kind of egocentricity. But he himself was an individual who embodied a sense of compassion, who embodied a sense of understanding, who embodied a sense of love that he sought to teach to his companions and recognize first and foremost that you are brothers and sisters, not even simply just in faith, but in humanity. And that simple recognition would allow for you to understand that you have to be in a place where gentleness and kindness is something that goes hand in hand with everything else that you have. For many of us, our challenge is that our understanding of this deen becomes purely legalistic. And we have a legalistic framework. There are do's and don'ts. There are steps to our prayer and steps to our fasting. But there's also a lot that talks about just ideas of love, ideas of compassion, ideas of understanding, ideas of hope. And the two have to be able to synergize and connect to one another to really be able to understand why it is that we pray in the first place. It's not to feed our egos and to say that we're better at it than others, but everything goes back to Allah. And to be able to understand who we truly conceptualize God to be is indicative based off of how we treat God's creation. And if you want to be in a place where you can really affirm and assess where your relationship with your Lord stands, then try to understand how you embody the characteristics of your Lord in whatever capacity, limited or otherwise, you can. We call upon Him as Rahman and Rahim 17 times a day at a minimum. And when we look at His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this was a man who truly represented God in every sense of the word. That undoubtedly when you met Muhammad alayhi salam, you knew that not only God existed, but that was a merciful God, a compassionate God, a just God. And what he told his companions was to recognize at a base level, whatever it was that you could to bring people in, not push people out. His companions were people who were from the lowest of social classes, people who did not have a lot of wealth. They were men and women. As much as there were people who were Arab, who were like him, he also had companions who were the likes of Abu Dhar of the Ghaffar tribe, Salman al-Farsi, the Persian, Suhaib al-Rumi, white-skinned, blonde hair, blue eyes, Bilal ibn Rabah, a man who was black, who was Abyssinian. Arguably the companion who was the only one to be with the Prophet from the day he was born until the day he died was a woman by the name of Ayman Barakah, who at 16 years of age was taken as a servant in the household of Abdullah, the Prophet ﷺ's father. And she was an Abyssinian woman, a black woman, a woman who, when the companions sought to remember the Prophet after he passed away, the likes of Abu Bakr and Umar would go to be with Ayman Barakah because of her closeness to him. There was not superficiality in that relationship. Our challenge is such that our connection is not through La ilaha illallah. We connect through the external, shared culture, shared country of origin, shared race, shared ethnicity, shared social class. And even where we connect on deen, we connect on it at a level where it says that you have to be in these boxes in order for you to be with me. But the weight of that La ilaha illallah is more heavy than you can imagine. The Prophet has a companion by the name of Osama ibn Zayd. Osama ibn Zayd is the child of a man by the name of Zayd ibn Haritha, who is so close to the Prophet of God that on one occasion he's actually known as Zayd ibn Muhammad, Zayd the son of Muhammad. And when revelation comes down that says that you can't assume the natal identity of any individual, a child will always be the son of their parent, Zayd ibn Muhammad goes back to being Zayd ibn Haritha. He's also the child of this woman that we just talked about, Ayman Barakah. Both are close companions to the Prophet of God, and Osama ibn Zayd is so close to the Prophet ﷺ. We have narrations in our tradition where the Prophet would put his own grandson on one knee and put Osama ibn Zayd on another knee, and he would make dua to Allah, Ya Allah, love them as I love them. There's no doubt that the Prophet loved Osama. When Osama ibn Zayd is older, he finds himself in the battlefield. And he and a man from the Ansar, a man who is Medanese, they're taking somebody on in combat. They're going back and forth and back and forth. And right before Osama ibn Zayd is about to take the man's life, he says, La ilaha illallah. And Osama ibn Zayd has seconds to decide what to do. He decides to take his life. The Ansari man, he goes back to the Prophet and says, Ya Rasulullah, this is what happened. This man said, La ilaha illallah, and Osama took his life. Is this what we're supposed to do? Our teachers tell us is that Osama bin Zayd was not telling on this man, but he wanted to know if he found himself in that situation, what would be the proper course of action. So the Prophet ﷺ, he says to Osama ibn Zayd, did you kill him after he said, La ilaha illallah? Osama says, Ya Rasulullah, innama kana muta'awwidha, that he was just seeking protection. He says, did you kill him after he said, La ilaha illallah? He says, Ya Rasulullah, he was just scared to die. He says, Ya Osama, did you open up his chest and look into his heart to see that that was the reason as to why he was doing it? And he continues to ask him over and over, did you kill him after he said La ilaha illallah? Did you kill him after he said La ilaha illallah? Aqataltuhu ba'da ma qala La ilaha illallah. Until Osama ibn Zayd says, I wish I became Muslim after that day so I would not have disappointed the Prophet in the way that I did. Osama ibn Zayd finds himself in another battle now. And the circumstance is such that there is somebody who is from the opposition who is causing detriment to the Muslim community. Osama ibn Zayd comes up from behind him, he surprises him, he raises his sword. This man says La ilaha illallah, and now Osama has moments to decide what he's going to do. He decides to take this person's life as well. The people go back to the Prophet and they say, Ya Rasulullah, rejoice, that man who is causing us great problems, Osama ibn Zayd took care of him. The Prophet says, tell me how it took place. Osama recounts the entire experience, that I came up from behind him, I raised my sword, he said La ilaha illallah, and I took his life. The Prophet says, Lima qataltahu, then why did you kill him? And Osama understands. He says, Astaghfirli ya Rasulullah, seek forgiveness on my behalf, O Messenger of God. Usama ibn Zayd, he says, Ya Usama, كيف تسمعون بالله إله إلا الله فإذا جاءت باليوم القيامة? That, oh Usama, what are you going to do when he comes carrying that La ilaha illallah against you on that day of judgment? He says, Astaghfirli ya Rasulullah, seek forgiveness on my behalf, O Messenger of God. He says, what are you going to do, Osama, if he comes carrying that La ilaha illallah against you on that day of judgment? These were men who were engaged in battle, that were killing people. And simply because they uttered that La ilaha illallah, that was it. And you think about really how little in comparison it takes for us to put qualifications on somebody else's goodness and their faith. And you then think about whose sunnah is it that we really actually follow? Whose sunnah is it that we really actually adhere to? Where there is understanding, where there is gentleness, where there is compassion, where there is mercy. It can be hard. You got to wrestle with your nafs sometimes. It can be hard. You got to just be honest with yourself. We have a tendency to be individuals who like to see where it is that other people are lacking. You don't dress the way you're supposed to dress. How can you keep the company that you keep? How do you engage in the social life that you engage in? Why is it that you do the things that you do? People have their struggles. You have the option of deciding how it is that you will embody the salient characteristics of this tradition. Where our Prophet ﷺ, he tells us that Allah is kind and He loves kindness. That God is kind and He loves kindness, and He gives for gentleness what He does not give for harshness. And the embodiment of that necessitates being able to put yourself in the shoes of those who it is that are actually going through certain challenges. To know that just saying words to people is not actually anything that indicates wisdom. But there has to be a sense of real recognition of where it is that people are coming from. And this is not to give a blanket impression that our deen does not have parameters within it. We are not a religion of egocentricity. It's a God-centric religion, and what that assumes is that there are certain things that God will ask us to do that we like to do, and certain things that God asks us to do that we don't want to do. But it's not about us, it's about Allah. But within that frame, being able to understand that for some of us, or all of us, we are people who will do things that we're not supposed to do. That in our understanding, there was only one who was perfect, and that was not you or I. So that means we all have our flaws, we all have our fallacies, we have our shortcomings. And we don't have to be self-deprecating in our analysis, but now we really think about, why is it that I'm saying to somebody what it is that I'm about to say? Why is it that I'm going in a direction that is going to now pretty much impact the heart of somebody that I'm about to engage? And do I have any semblance of understanding just how people work? The Prophet has a companion who embraces the deen of Islam. And upon embracing the deen of Islam, he asks the Prophet to teach him something. And so the Prophet says that when you hear somebody sneeze, say, Yarhamukullah, this is a right that they have over you. And so this man, he is excited. He has learned something directly from the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They now line up to pray. And when the prayer takes place, in the course of the prayer, somebody sneezes out loud. And this man has learned from the Prophet that when somebody sneezes, you say, Yarhamakullah. So he heard the sneeze, and he says out loud in the prayer, Yarhamakullah. The companions start to look at him, indicating to him that he needs to be silent. And the man, he starts to feel anxiety inside. He feels uncomfortable. And so he speaks out loud again, and he says, why are you looking at me? And the narration says that they start to slap the inner parts of their thighs to indicate to him that he needs to stop talking. And he gets it. He doesn't talk anymore. At the end of the prayer, he says, I swear by God, Muhammad is the best of teachers. He did not scold me, he did not revile me, he did not repudiate me. He simply said to me that in the course of this prayer of ours, we are reciting the words of God. And it's not appropriate to mix them with other words. Now, I want you to think for a moment. Both the companions and the Prophet got this man to understand that you don't talk while you pray. But one of them got the point across and made the person feel terrible, and the other got the point across and made the person feel very good. This is my son, Kareem. You have anything to say? It's not just about giving information and throwing it at people, but to be able to understand that you have to talk to someone and not actually at them. That you have to be in a place where you can recognize and understand that as a person, as a human being, people come with realities. They're not just individuals that you yell at and scream at, without understanding what the impact of your words will actually be upon them. And to take into real consideration what narrations mean that say things to the effect of Man kana yu'minu billahi wa bil yawmil akhir falyakul khayran aw liyasmut. That whosoever is habitually, constantly believing in Allah in the last day, then let him speak good or be silent. That means that if there is not a mechanism whereby you will be a person. You doing okay? That can connect to a person where they're coming from, then don't say anything. Because you don't want to push hearts away. And you gotta believe in a God, whether people understand you or not, whether people have been harsh to you or not, that loves you more than anybody in creation can love you. We can't let our understanding of our Lord be dictated by those who claim to speak on his behalf but have no real understanding of who he is or what it is that he actually embodies. He has everything that he needs. And where we fail to recognize just simple goodness in people, we push away hearts. We could be pushing away some of our greatest of resources. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu an was a man who under his authority, the Muslim community expanded massively. He was the second caliph in Islam. Of him, the Prophet ﷺ said, لَوْ كَانَ نَبِيًّا بَعْدِي لَكَانَ عُمَرٌ, that if there was a messenger after me, it would be this man, Umar. Prior to Umar becoming Muslim, he did a lot of things that nobody thought made him good. He has a narration where he says that when I think back to my days prior to my Islam, I remember an instance that makes me smile and one that makes me cry. And the instance that makes him smile is that he was traveling, and while he was traveling, he had forgotten the idol that he would worship, and he fashioned a makeshift idol out of some dates. And then when he got hungry, he started to eat the dates that he had formulated that idol from. And the instance that makes him weep, he says that customary at that time, people wanted sons, they didn't want daughters. And when they would have a daughter, they would literally bury them alive in the ground. And Umar says, I can remember feeling my daughter's hand go limp in my hand as I buried her alive. Then in some narrations, I felt her hand whisk against the bottom of my beard. Umar used to drink alcohol like crazy. Umar had a servant by the name of Lubayna that he would beat so much that when he would stop, he would say, don't think I have sympathy for you. I'm just tired. When I get my strength back, I'm going to start again. On one occasion, Umar sees a woman by the name of Layla. And Layla looks as if she's going on a journey. And Umar asks her, what is it that you are doing? Where are you going? And Layla says, you have made it very hard for me to worship my God here. I need to go someplace else when I can worship him. And she expects now an onslaught at the hands of Umar ibn al-Khattab. This man who is an excessive drinker of alcohol, this man who beats Muslim women, this man who buried his daughter alive. And to her astonishment, he says, go and have peace on your journey. She goes home and tells her husband, a man by the name of Amr. And Amr says, what is it that you are saying? You sound as if you actually believe that Umar ibn al-Khattab could become Muslim. She says, why couldn't he become Muslim? And Amr says, know this. The donkey of Umar's father would become Muslim before he does. Nobody thought there was anything good with Umar ibn al-Khattab, except the Prophet ﷺ. And so where everyone saw inadequacy in what was lacking, the Prophet saw what was inherently good. And he made dua uniquely to Allah, Allahumma izz al-Islam bi habba rajalani ilayk, Amr ibn Hisham or Umar ibn al-Khattab. That, oh Allah, bring some izzah, bring some strength to Islam by the one of the two men who is more beloved to you, Amr ibn Hisham, or we know as Abu Jahl, or Umar ibn al-Khattab. The dua is accepted and Umar becomes Muslim. Just days prior, Hamza had become Muslim. And the Islam of Umar was transformative. For the first time, the Muslims could walk through the streets of Mecca without fear of being persecuted, abused, mocked, or ridiculed. Umar walked at the front of one line, Hamza walked at the front of another line. Between the two lines, the Prophet walked. Umar went and knocked on the door of Abu Jahl, and he was excited to see his champion, Marhaban ya Umar. And Umar simply says to him, Aslamtu, I've become Muslim. And he says to him, La taf'al, don't do it. And he says, Fa'alt, it's done. And then there's nothing that they can say because this is Umar ibn al-Khattab. Now I want you to think for a second. How many Umars do we push away? Because we don't really get why they do the things that they do. Because we turn Islam into a weapon whereby we just push people down as opposed to anything that is uplifting and elevating and gives them vibrancy in life. You don't want to be the cause of hurting somebody's heart. And more importantly, what you want to think, if you have been on the end where somebody has hurt you or judged you in that way, what if Umar believed everything that the people said about him? What if he actually thought that he wasn't good enough? Arguably, many of us wouldn't even be sitting here in this space right now, because we wouldn't have had him as the catalyst for everything that he brought. So just think deeply about what this deen is about to you and how it is that you can utilize it as a source of strength and a source of good. The Prophet had companions who came to him, Ya Rasulullah, I've committed zina. Ya Rasulullah, I drink alcohol. Ya Rasulullah, I kissed a woman that I wasn't supposed to. They're not engaging in a confessional to let out feelings of guilt, but they know that the person that they're talking to will allow for them to understand that they are bigger than the worst of their actions, and despite what it is that they have done that is plaguing their heart, He will still walk with them through everything that they have going on. Abdullah is a companion of the Prophet ﷺ. There are narrations where the Prophet and Abdullah are laughing together quite often. Abdullah would come regularly to take the had punishment because he had a drinking problem. And when he would come, the companions would speak poor of him. Some of them did. And when they would speak poorly of him, the Prophet would say, "Don't say those things. He loves God and His Messenger." And it sets the scenario for us in every role that we could possibly be. First and foremost, you're struggling with something, struggle. Take it on. Let yourself be in a place where you acknowledge and admit, and then just try your best. If you fall down again, try to get back up. And if you are in the place where someone is going through their struggle, you now have the two scenarios in front of you of which you want to be. Those who will utilize it to push somebody further down, or embodying the character of the Prophet of God ﷺ and being a source of upliftment. Because if we know that the Prophet said Abdullah loves God and His Messenger, then most definitely Abdullah knows that the Prophet said that about him. And what do you think that does for him in terms of his confidence? His ability to believe that he can be better than what it is that he has going on. You just got to celebrate with people sometimes, to let them understand that you are there to meet them where they are at. And that each individual goes through their own challenges. Each individual has to make their choices and decisions. Each individual is in a place where they are entitled to a relationship with God. Don't take it away from them. In my community, I had a woman who came to see me who had an alcoholic lifestyle. And she said, "I see how it's ruining my life, it's ruining my relationships. I don't want to be this anymore." And so she was going through the steps of being able to overcome her challenge. And as we talked it out, I said to her that just try your best. She then came to see me and she said that I have to go visit my family who also drinks, and I'm really scared because if I'm surrounded by it, I don't know if I'm ready. I gave her my cell phone number and I said, "Call me if you need anything." I didn't hear from her and I didn't know what was going on. When she came back to see me sometime later, she said everything was fine. My family, they were too drunk to realize I wasn't drinking. I said, "I guess that's good." And now she started to deal with it for herself and her own growth. And there were days that she went without it, and there were days that she fell back into it, and the days that she didn't started to exceed the days that she did. And then those days turned into weeks, and they turned into months, and they turned into a longer period of time. And after about 6 months, I said to her, "Get all of your friends together." And we took them all out for dinner to celebrate. And they didn't have to know why, but it was more so for this woman. Because what she needed wasn't somebody who, when she came with her struggle, to just throw in her face, "Oh, that's haram," and that's it. She knows it's haram. She needs somebody to walk with her and let her believe that she can overcome, that there's understanding, that there's compassion, that there's real support, there's real brotherhood and sisterhood. Think. How is it that in our hadith we're taught that smiling is a sadaqah, it's a charity? How? And ask God to make you a person who actually smiles in such a way that it is a sadaqah, it is a charity. That you have such a warmth, that you have such a demeanor, a personality, that without condition and qualification, you bring people into you, even if the rest of the world tells you that you shouldn't. You open yourself up to new perspectives and new ideas. And you understand that for some people, life isn't just as simple as we make it to be. If I can ever be helpful to any of you in any of the work that you have or any of the things that you're doing, please don't hesitate in reaching out. I'm from New York City, which is far from here, but we don't have to make physical distance a barrier for us to be able to remain connected as brothers and sisters. And if this is the only time that we are meant to be together, yeah, you know, I've been throughout a lot of Europe. I was just recently in Prague, and in Prague, you know, there's not really any Muslims. People hate Islam in Prague. It's like vehemently they hate it. And trying to understand the realities of the refugee crisis vis-a-vis its relationship to Islam and the perceptions of Islam, where I got to walk through Prague in terms of how they were treating refugees. They took us to the trains that the refugees came in on, going through Prague to other countries, but those, for whatever reason, that got emptied out into Prague found themselves dealt with in really harsh ways. Literally, they had numbers on their arms, reminiscent of internment camps, put into not even hostels, but areas that just had them confined upon each other. And the severe loathing that people had of those that were coming was so deep that in Prague and in different parts of Europe, the word refugee actually carried a negative connotation to it. People said it with disdain. And it's people who left their homes filled with hostility and violence. I mean, we saw young children who drowned in the sea trying to escape from the reality of Syria, and their infant bodies washed up on shores. And despite those being realities, you still had people who said, we don't want these people here. And I think the challenge that we have is in much of the world, not limited to Europe and the United States, but arguably everywhere, there's a tendency to have a lot of inequity, and there's a tendency to have a certain fear of that which is the other. The us versus them mentality that we have necessitates understanding just how basic social identity formation works. We think in boxes. And how those boxes actualize themselves can be by profession, by gender, by sexuality, by political ideology, by religion, by faith, by spirituality, by social class, by your familial relationships, father, son, husband, whatever. But I think in these ways, this is what everyone can be. I then, as a second step, say what it is that I am. I am Muslim, I'm American, I am Imam, I am chaplain, I'm father, I'm brother, I'm husband, I'm uncle, I'm nephew, all these things. And the affirmation of what it is that I am As a third step, I then identify the boxes that I am not, to become more concrete in my identity. Where we find familiarity lends us to then not just exaggerate where we have differences, but also to exaggerate similarities. So we put up with a lot more from people who are just like us, but when someone is different from us, we don't tolerate even an iota of something that we believe isn't okay. And so the way that it functions is that us versus them mentality capitalizes on those mindsets and tells us to hate that much more what is different from us and to become that much more cohesive on singularized variables that we have in common, like race, like ethnicity, like shared culture. And you know people do it. And so where we now think about us as human beings necessitates understanding things that are just innate within us. There's a man by the name of Henry Tajfel, who was a Polish Jew. Henry Tajfel lived at a time where Jewish people couldn't attend universities in Poland. And so he ended up going to a school in France. Many of his family and friends were put into concentration camps. And Henry Tajfel was able to get away with being not understood as a Jewish man because he spoke French. But eventually they got him as well, and he was able to survive those genocidal Holocaust camps. But much of his family did not. When he came out of it, he started research to try to just ask the question and answer, how is it that we as humans can commit genocide? How is it that we can actually kill in this way? And how is it that we can see it taking place and not do anything to stop it, especially when we have the means to? So he develops a theory that's called the minority group paradigm. And in his research and in his studies, when he brings together random groups of people, he finds that at the most minute level, people will use anything to discriminate against each other. Even if you have different eye color, people will use that as a way to say, I'm somehow better than you because we are different, or you are somehow who shouldn't be with me because we are different. Media apparatus and political machines then take advantage of this for their own objectives. Why the people in Prague hated Islam was every time you turn on a television screen, there was a politician who was maligning Islam. In my country, statistically, the rise in anti-Muslim sentiment and violence against Muslims is not done in reaction to attacks carried out by fools who have no understanding what Islam is about. But the rise statistically in anti-Muslim sentiment is tied to election cycles. So when people start to run for office and they know that there is a deeply entrenched racism and bigotry and fear that they can capitalize on, they start to put out there the sound bites, not caring who it is that it's going to impact. And it works that way in Europe, it works that way in the United States, even works that way in Malaysia. I haven't been here that long, but I would be quite comfortable in assuming that there are minority populations here that don't get treated well simply by virtue of the fact that there are minority populations. In our tradition, the sin that casts Shaitan out of Jannah is racism. He says, I am of fire, he is of dirt, why should I prostrate to him? Essentially, where I come from is better than where he comes from. So why would I let myself be debased in that way? But his real debasement came from the arrogance of his racism. You don't want to embody that in and of itself. Where I think you can create opportunity to combat this is through the kind of events that you do and you bring in people. And I can appreciate both your presence and the courage that brings you here. I don't know if anybody else is not Muslim, but to be able to understand that where there is opportunity to really challenge that kind of darkness necessitates us having to think strategically. Because organized evil will always triumph over disorganized righteousness. And your well intentions alone are not going to be able to combat those who have been doing this for years, and they have systemic and structural mechanisms. I know for a fact that most of you probably don't care what happens in my country until this presidential election, and you are afraid what will happen to you if Donald Trump becomes our president. You can see what the realities are. When you let injustice and oppression build itself up, just because it's not happening to you doesn't mean it's not happening. When it exists in this much of a quantity, but it grows and grows and grows and grows, it can now erupt into the reality that we see taking place thousands of miles away, but can still bear impact here. In Islam, as a tradition, the metaphysical is a reality that we embrace. And I'll end with this. I know we have to pray. So where those who interject wrongness and injustice into this world, you have to balance it out by doing that much more good. So if you turn your Islam into a means by which you push people down, and you oversimplify it by saying that this is wrong and that's wrong and you're haram, people who hate Muslims don't discriminate in their hatred. They don't say that that's a Muslim who dresses a certain way, and that's a Muslim who covers their head, and that's a Muslim who's Sunni, and that's a Muslim who's Shia, and that's a Muslim who is black and who is white, and Salafi and Sufi, and follows a madhab and doesn't. They hate all Muslims. And if they're not going to discriminate against us in terms of how they understand our goodness, they just categorically put us in a box, then don't separate yourself from one another. It makes it easier for them to push us down. Where the Prophet says, follow a bad deed with a good one. You can think about that in terms of yourself. Where you do wrong, immediately do right after. But where you see somebody else doing wrong, allow for yourself to follow their wrongness also with rightness. And the dua that the Prophet made for the people who would persecute, mock, ridicule his people was, Allahumma gfir li qawmi fa innahum la ya'lamoon. That, oh Allah, have your maghfirah, your forgiveness on my qawm, not my ummah, my qawm, my locale, my city, because indeed they do not understand. There was still always an element of love and understanding and compassion, even for those who push them down. So to let yourself be the catalyst for bringing that understanding. And to see where the media fails, you create your own content and you start to push out stories. I would say this to you as your brother, speaking to those of you who are Malaysian and you live in this country. Every person I talked to before I left the United States and told them I was coming to Malaysia, whether they were Muslim or not, they said, oh, the people there are so nice. I said, have you ever been to Malaysia? And they said, no. I said, how do you know that? Oh, I just heard that. It's a positive stereotype. And you're a Muslim country and a culture. And you have a different recognition, at least globally. I don't know what it's like on the ground here. That if you understand the connectivity of the ummah, and really what it means to be one body, and when one part of us is not working, the entire body feels the ailment, you can leverage what it is that you have access to here to be able to bring benefit to your brothers and sisters around the world and give people an insight into Islam that isn't necessarily seen in many parts of the world. I've walked through the streets of your country and I see people who are of every skin color, people who are seemingly of different faiths. They're all sitting and eating in the same restaurants. Nobody would think that would happen in a Muslim country, especially the likes of a Donald Trump and the people who follow him. You got to get your story out there. You got to show people what it is that you can actively do that allows for people to understand that religion is just religion, and some people will choose it as a means to do good, and some people will choose it as a means to do bad, but you use it as a means of benefit. Again, inshallah, if I can be helpful in any way, please let me know. I know the time for Maghrib is in, but thank you for letting my family and I join you here, especially in this auspicious gathering of celebrating Eid. Inshallah ta'ala, Allah Azza wa Jal blesses each of you immensely and allows for all of us to do just what it is that is for His sake and His sake alone. Wallahu ta'ala alam wa billahi tawfiq. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.